I've covered campaigns sort of on and off for 10, 15 years. And I've covered them mostly in the ways that we see them as we consume them through newspapers or TV, which is, the goal is to sort of stick as close to the candidate as you can. You spend a lot of time writing about what amount to fairly minor shifts in language or presentation at speeches and rallies, big scheduled events like debates, the sort of back and forth between the press secretaries and their press releases or conference calls, the sort of stupid stuff that they want you to write about every day. And in 2008, I was a reporter at the Boston Globe, covering a campaign in more or less this way, flying around with candidates, mostly McCain, but plenty with Obama and Hillary too. And it was only after that race that I realized how limited a view of the modern campaign I was getting, and by extension, and all the other members of the press, and by extension, our readers or viewers. What I realized, I sort of stumbled into this sort of geek subculture in campaigns, kind of inadvertently, and I realized that I may have been focusing almost exclusively on what John McCain did on a stage every day, but there were tons of people back at headquarters who thought that they had a lot of other levers that they could pull on a given day to move votes, and that we were only looking at the sort of most public, performative part of the modern campaign, and had failed to understand all the other ways in which campaigns interacted with voters. And it turned out, as I learned, that those were the areas in which campaigns had gotten a lot smarter in the years in which I rather obliviously had been covering them. People bought TV ads and staged rallies more or less exactly the same way that they did in 1988. Everything else had changed dramatically, in part because of these experiments, and in part because of the new data and analysis they could do. And so I realized that it was a way that telling the story of this shift could help me explain what the campaigns are actually doing, which media coverage is horrible at, could allow me to sort of understand some recent campaigns in a way that, if not totally at odds with the story that's been told, really differs, I think, from the sort of common idea of how elections have been won. But also get to this interesting culture clash over the question of, how do we understand what is going on in an election? And too often, I think we tell ourselves one big story about the dynamics of an election, where in fact, we probably should be telling ourselves millions of little stories about individual voters and their psychologies and the effects of small interactions that they're having with campaigns.
It's hard to tell that story, and get away from the frame of, well, it's just one or two things, a narrative of one or two competing drivers, right?
Right, and so I always realized this was a central problem, not just from a media perspective, but from the perspective of campaigns trying to understand themselves. And part of the problem with campaigns is they've been sort of resistant to innovation because they're resistant to self-examination. And I had an inkling of this even well before the sort of period in 2009 where I came to understand some of these things, because I always liked the day after the election, the Wednesday morning, because I could call my sources on the campaign and they'd be a little more candid with me about what had happened because they didn't really have any secrets to protect anymore. And you'd always have one of two types of conversations. I would call the people on the winning campaign, and I'd ask, so what happened? Why'd you win? And very quickly the conversation would become about some discrete activity that took place that almost invariably that person was directly involved in, right? So it's like, you call the media consultant, the person makes the TV ads, and it's like, what happened, why'd you win? And you get this story that's, a week out, we were down, so I looked really closely in the polls. We were just getting slaughtered with married women, so I tore up the media plan for the last weekend. I rushed into the studio. I told the director, I just want to make this last ad all pink. We're going to go shoot the candidate in front of a house with a swing set. And we made the ad overnight. We pulled down all our other ads. We rushed it to the studio. For the last weekend, we just ran the pink house ad wall to wall. By election day, we closed the gap on married women. We squeezed it out. And then you call the communications director, the speechwriter, and you hear the story about that one line that they told in that radio debate that totally changed the terms of the conversation. And you go talk to the advance person who sets up the events, and you hear that 6 weeks out they made some brilliant decision to stop going to diners and only go to pumpkin patches. And by the end we'd killed it with the pumpkin patch vote. And you call the losing campaign and you say what happened? Why'd you lose? And all of a sudden it's like the candidate sucked, she wouldn't raise any money, it was a horrible year to be a Democrat, the economy was bad, and you realize the campaign was incapable, nobody in the campaign was capable of honestly taking credit or attributing blame, and by extension had no way of learning from their successes or their failures. And because campaigns are basically the worst company you could possibly imagine, right? So like, here's a startup company that exists for like 6 or 9 months. They care only about market share on some random Tuesday in November. Whether or not they succeed, they go out of business the next day. The person who's at that point, everybody scatters. The consultants are on to the next thing. The candidate, rightfully, if they win, is back to governing or planning a transition. If they lose, is on a beach somewhere feeling sorry for him or herself. That the candidate who's like the CEO or chairman of this business is always somebody who's either done it before, in which case they know everything and just going to do the same thing again with the same people, or they've never done it, in which case there is absolutely no good reason why, if you are a city council person or a justice of the peace, you should have any idea how to run a multi-million-dollar political marketing corporation when you first run for Congress. And so they're totally in hock to people whose every incentive is aligned to do the same thing over and over again and not ask any questions about whether or not it works, because there's no way that they can be held accountable afterwards if it doesn't.
And they're looking to squeeze the most income out of the campaign.
Yeah, and they're either competing. You got either one of two dynamics, which is equally unhealthy. So a campaign has a bunch of specialist consultants, and sometimes there's a general consultant who sort of runs the traffic among them. So you have the person who does the mail, and the person who does the phone, and the person who does the web ads, and the person who does the TV ads, either they're competing with one another for share of the budget, in which case almost every strategic question becomes a question of like mode of delivery. So you sit around the table and you ask like, what should we do? And the TV guy always wants to buy more TV ads, and the mail person always wants to send more mail. And so they basically always have to think that what they sell is the solution to whatever problem a campaign faces. Or if the happy scenario, which is like, does not create for any more healthy and intellectual environment, is that they basically are a cartel that reforms around a different candidate every 2 years. And so it's like, I'm the mail guy and I'll bring in my friend the phone guy and I'll bring in the TV guy. And nobody really wants to challenge one another because we know how we split the pie and we can convince this candidate to do what we tell him is best, and then we'll just go on together and I'm avoiding using the words Con and Mark here, but there's no reason why you would engage in a small turf battle for another 3% of this budget, because it's much better to know that we have a good relationship. The next time you have a race in some other county, you'll pull me into it. And so, campaigns were immune to any honest self-examination, and nobody in a campaign reasonably wants to invest in any sort of research that's going to yield a lesson in December. And it became very hard, even these experiments, no campaign wants to take voters out and put them in a control group and say, we're not going to talk to these people to learn a lesson in December. And so the places that bring innovation into campaigns are institutions that have a longer horizon. They're either academics that are pursuing academic questions that end up inadvertently being useful for politics, or they're institutions like the AFL-CIO ends up being a big character in my book. They're around year after year, and they actually want to get 3% smarter for next year because they're going to spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars on politics. And they actually invert the leverage, and consultants want to please the political director of the AFL because there's a lot of money next year and the year after if they're the sort of chosen pollster or whatever. And so when those institutions start to say, hey, we like these tools from academia to actually test this stuff, their consultants were in the position where they couldn't blow them off.